If someone handed you the ultimate cheat code to print an infinite amount of money, you would logically assume that your financial problems were solved forever. You would believe that with unlimited funds you could buy any asset, defeat any enemy, and build an empire that would last until the end of time. In the 16th century, the Spanish Empire was handed exactly that cheat code. When the Spanish conquistadors sailed across the Atlantic and conquered the New World, they didn't just discover new land, they stumbled upon the greatest, most concentrated supply of precious metals in human history. Almost overnight, Spain took absolute control of massive, seemingly bottomless mountains of gold and silver. They possessed the ultimate infinite money glitch. Galleon after galleon, heavily guarded fleets sailed back to Europe with hulls practically bursting with raw, unadulterated wealth. By all traditional logic, Spain should have established an eternal, utopian superpower that ruled the globe for the next 1,000 years. But history is rarely logical, and economics is utterly ruthless. Instead of cementing their absolute dominance, this unimaginable mountain of gold and silver became a terrifying, unavoidable curse. Despite possessing more hard currency than any other nation on earth, the Spanish Empire achieved something historically humiliating. They ran out of money. In fact, their financial collapse was so spectacular that Spain became the first sovereign nation in recorded history to declare absolute bankruptcy. And they didn't just do it once. The empire that literally owned the global money printer defaulted on its massive debts repeatedly throughout the late 1500s and 1600s. How is it mathematically possible to go completely broke when you literally own the gold mines? In this video, we are going to explore the darkest, most profound economic paradox in human history. We will look past the battles and the conquerors to expose the brutal financial reality of the Spanish collapse. We will uncover how the massive influx of free money triggered the world's first great inflation, utterly destroyed Spain's domestic industries, and proved a devastating economic law that modern central banks are still actively ignoring today. We are going to reveal the terrifying truth that the Spanish kings learned the hard way. Currency is not the same thing as wealth, and having all the money in the world is the fastest way to destroy a nation if you don't understand how money actually works.
When we look back at the origins of the Spanish Empire's wealth, the story usually begins with violence and extraction. In the decades following Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492, Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro swept across the Americas. They ruthlessly dismantled the Aztec and Incan empires, completely driven by an insatiable hunger for one specific asset: gold. They looted temples, melted down priceless, centuries-old artifacts into crude bullion, and shipped it all back across the Atlantic. It was a massive transfer of wealth. But economically speaking, the looted gold of the fallen indigenous empires was merely the appetizer. The true financial hack, the discovery that would forever alter the global economy and ultimately doom the Spanish Empire, was not found in a conquered city. It was found buried deep inside a freezing, desolate mountain. In 1545, high in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Bolivia, sitting at a breathtaking altitude of 13,000 feet, a local indigenous miner stumbled upon a massive vein of silver ore. The Spanish quickly realized this was not just a normal mine. This single peak, which they named Cerro Rico, or the Rich Hill, was practically made of solid silver. The scale of Cerro Rico is almost impossible to comprehend through a modern lens. It was the largest concentrated deposit of silver ever discovered in human history. Almost overnight, a barren, freezing mountain peak transformed into the bustling, chaotic metropolis of Potosí. At its height, Potosí had a population larger than London, Paris, or Rome. It was the undisputed engine of the 16th century global economy. For the next century, it is estimated that this single mountain produced a staggering 60 to 80% of all the silver in the entire world. To the Spanish crown, sitting comfortably in Madrid, thousands of miles away, Cerro Rico was the ultimate economic cheat code. In a traditional economy, if a king wants to raise capital, he has to foster domestic industries, encourage trade, and then carefully collect taxes from a productive population. It requires complex management and balanced ledgers. But Spain didn't have to do any of that. They implemented a brutal forced labor system known as the mita, enslaving the indigenous population to extract the ore from the toxic, suffocating depths of the mountain. The human cost was horrific and completely incalculable, but from the cold, mechanical perspective of the Spanish royal accountants, the profit margins were absolute perfection. It was free labor, extracting free money. To transport this astronomical wealth back to Europe, Spain engineered the legendary Flota de Indias, or the Spanish treasure fleets. Twice a year, massive convoys of heavily armed, multi-deck galleons would gather in the Caribbean. Their hulls were packed to the absolute breaking point with meticulously stamped silver pieces of 8 and solid gold bars. They braved hurricanes and relentless pirate attacks to cross the Atlantic Ocean and deliver their payload to the port city of Seville. When those galleons arrived, the sheer volume of hard currency pouring into the royal treasury was intoxicating. Millions upon millions of pesos flowed directly into the hands of King Charles V and later his son, King Philip II. This created a fatal psychological shift within the Spanish monarchy. They looked at the endless fleets arriving in Seville and truly believed they had achieved financial invincibility. They believed because they had a monopoly on the global money supply, the normal rules of economics simply did not apply to them anymore. They didn't need to worry about balancing budgets or building a sustainable domestic economy. If they ever needed more money to fund a war, build a palace, or buy foreign luxuries, they could just wait for the next fleet of galleons to arrive from the New World. They thought they had hacked the system. But the Spanish kings were completely blind to a terrifying macroeconomic law that was about to rip their empire apart from the inside out. They were about to learn what happens when you introduce too much money into an economy that produces absolutely nothing.
The fatal flaw of the Spanish Empire was rooted in a profound, almost arrogant misunderstanding of what money actually is. In the 16th century, the formal study of macroeconomics simply did not exist. The kings, the royal advisors, and the elite nobility of Spain were masters of military strategy, theology, and political conquest, but they were completely and utterly financially illiterate. They suffered from a massive economic blind spot. They looked at the raw silver pouring in from the mines of Potosí and equated it directly with national wealth. But they failed to understand the most foundational rule of human economics. Currency itself has no intrinsic value. You cannot eat silver. You cannot wear gold to keep warm in the winter. You cannot build a house out of pieces of 8. Real wealth is determined entirely by a nation's ability to produce actual, tangible goods and services, food, textiles, tools, and infrastructure. Currency is simply the agreed-upon medium we use to exchange those goods. When the heavily guarded Spanish treasure fleets arrived in the port of Seville, the crown immediately took its cut, the royal fifth. The king then took this massive influx of new silver and immediately pumped it into the Spanish economy to pay off his staggering debts, fund his royal court, and pay the wages of his massive, sprawling armies. Suddenly, the streets of Spain were absolutely flooded with hard cash. There was more silver circulating in the local economy than anyone had ever seen in the history of Europe. But there was a terrifying mathematical problem. While the supply of money had exploded overnight, the actual production of goods in Spain had remained completely stagnant. The Spanish farmers were not growing any more wheat. The weavers were not making any more wool. The blacksmiths were not forging any more tools. When you have a massive sudden increase in the money supply, but the supply of actual goods remains exactly the same, you trigger one of the most destructive forces in finance: too much money chasing too few goods. If a Spanish merchant selling a loaf of bread or a bolt of cloth suddenly realizes that his customers are walking into his shop with pockets completely overflowing with new silver from the Americas, what does he logically do? He raises his prices.
And when the merchant next door sees that, he raises his prices too. This silent, invisible mechanic triggered a terrifying economic chain reaction that swept across the entire Iberian Peninsula and eventually the rest of Europe. The value of the silver itself began to plummet. Because it was no longer rare, its purchasing power was actively being destroyed. To buy the exact same loaf of bread or the same piece of land that cost 1 silver coin a decade ago, you now needed 2. Then you needed 3. Then you needed 5. Historians and economists now refer to this devastating period as the price revolution. Over the course of the 16th century, the cost of basic living expenses, food and housing in Spain skyrocketed by an astonishing 400%. It was the first recorded instance of hyperinflation on a massive international scale. And the human cost of this inflation was absolutely catastrophic. For the Spanish monarchy and the wealthy merchants who had direct early access to the new silver, the inflation was manageable. But for the average working-class Spanish citizen, the farmers, the laborers, and the peasants, it was an absolute death sentence. While the prices of food and rent were exploding upward, the hard-earned coins they had saved under their mattresses were silently losing their value every single day. The people of Spain were actively starving and falling into crushing poverty, while simultaneously living inside an empire that claimed to be the richest nation on the face of the earth. The Spanish crown had achieved the impossible. They literally mined so much hard money out of the ground that they had accidentally replicated the exact same destructive inflation that modern central banks create when they print fiat currency out of thin air. But the inflation was just the first domino to fall. Because they had so much cash, the Spanish elite were about to make a decision that would permanently destroy their domestic economy and hand their immense wealth directly to their greatest enemies.
As the fires of hyperinflation burned through the Spanish working class, the aristocratic elite of the empire were suffering from a completely different disease, a toxic, terminal arrogance born of infinite wealth. In modern macroeconomics, there is a terrifying phenomenon known as the resource curse, sometimes referred to as the Dutch disease. It occurs when a nation discovers a massive, overwhelming supply of a single valuable resource, like oil in the 20th century, or in this case, silver in the 16th century. The sudden influx of cash artificially inflates the nation's currency, makes their domestic goods incredibly expensive, and completely destroys their incentive to manufacture anything else. In the 1500s, the Spanish Empire became patient zero for this exact economic plague. Because the Spanish crown and the elite nobility had access to a seemingly endless river of silver from Potosi, they developed a fatal psychological blind spot. They looked at the tedious, difficult work of building a sustainable economy, farming the land, weaving textiles, forging tools, and investing in new technologies, and they simply asked, why bother? Why would a Spanish merchant invest his time and capital into building a noisy, complicated textile mill in the city of Toledo, when he could simply wait for the galleons to arrive, take his cut of the silver, and buy premium, ready-made wool directly from London? Why would the Spanish government invest in agricultural innovation when they could just purchase massive shipments of grain from the Netherlands? It was absolute economic suicide disguised as imperial luxury. Within a few short decades, Spain's domestic economy began to completely wither and die. The once thriving silk manufacturers in Granada collapsed. The wool industry in Segovia was decimated. The agricultural sector was largely abandoned because the inflated cost of living made it impossible to pay farm laborers a livable wage, while foreign food imports remained artificially cheap. Spain transformed from a self-sustaining nation into a massive, heavily dependent consumer economy that produced almost absolutely nothing of its own. This created the ultimate historical irony and the most brutal wealth transfer of the early modern era. The heavily armed Spanish galleons would brave hurricanes, disease, and relentless pirate attacks to extract mountains of silver from the Americas and deliver it to the port of Seville. But that silver did not stay in Spain.
Because Spain produced nothing, they had to import everything to survive. To pay the massive invoices for English clothes, French weaponry, German manufactured goods, and Dutch food, the silver immediately bled out of the Spanish treasury. It flowed directly across the borders and into the pockets of foreign merchants. Spain had effectively transformed itself into a giant, incredibly inefficient conveyor belt. They were doing all the brutal, exhausting work of mining and transporting the wealth of the New World, only to hand that exact wealth directly to their geopolitical neighbors. While the Spanish domestic economy rotted from the inside out, the nations surrounding them began to experience an unprecedented economic boom. The influx of Spanish silver into countries like England and the Netherlands provided the exact liquidity those nations needed to kickstart the early stages of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. The Dutch used Spanish silver to build the world's first joint stock companies and the first modern stock exchange. The English used it to build a naval empire. Spain was literally funding the rise of its greatest geopolitical rivals. They had all the money in the world, but they were rapidly becoming the poorest nation in Western Europe. And instead of realizing their fatal economic mistake and attempting to rebuild their domestic industries, the Spanish monarchy decided to double down. If the money was leaking out of the country, the kings believed the only logical solution was to simply conquer the countries taking the money. They were about to use their infinite money glitch to fund an endless cycle of unwinnable wars. If you are fascinated by the brutal realities of economic history and want to understand the hidden forces that build and destroy empires, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss our upcoming deep dives into the shadow mechanics of the global economy.
As Spain's domestic economy crumbled into dust, the Spanish monarchy remained completely intoxicated by the illusion of their own wealth. King Philip II, sitting in his grand palace in Madrid, looked at the accounting ledgers and made a fatal geopolitical calculation. He believed that with an infinite supply of silver flowing from the Americas, he could simply buy global hegemony. If Spain could no longer produce its own goods, Philip decided they would just conquer the nations that did. Driven by absolute imperial arrogance and a desire to enforce religious supremacy across the continent, King Philip II plunged the Spanish Empire into a relentless, exhausting cycle of endless wars. He simultaneously fought the French, sent massive armadas to invade England, battled the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, and spent decades trying to crush a massive Protestant rebellion in the wealthy, highly productive Dutch provinces. But fighting a multi-front war across the European continent in the 16th century was an unimaginably expensive endeavor. You could not simply draft peasants, you had to hire massive armies of professional, ruthless mercenaries. And mercenaries did not accept national pride or promises of future glory as payment. They demanded hard, cold silver coins delivered on time every single month. This is where the catastrophic math of the Spanish Empire finally caught up with them. The Spanish treasure fleets from the Americas were spectacular, but they were incredibly slow. The galleons only arrived in Seville once or twice a year. Furthermore, the volume of silver extracted from Potosi, while massive, was physically finite. But the daily burning cost of supplying and paying tens of thousands of mercenaries fighting across 3 different countries was infinite. To bridge the gap between the arrival of the treasure fleets and the daily payroll of his armies, King Philip II did what any modern, desperate government does. He turned to the banks. Spain began taking out massive, high-interest loans, known as asientos, primarily from the wealthy, sophisticated merchant bankers of Genoa, Italy. The Genoese bankers were financial predators of the highest order. They happily gave the Spanish king the upfront cash he needed to pay his mercenaries, but they demanded exorbitant interest rates, often charging upwards of 40 to 60%. And as collateral, they demanded direct ownership of the next shipment of silver before it even left the Americas. Spain had officially fallen into the ultimate fiat debt trap. Before the galleons even arrived in the port of Seville, the silver inside them was already entirely owned by foreign banks.
By the mid-1550s, the Spanish Empire was spending more money on interest payments than it was bringing in from the entire New World. The infinite money glitch had been completely reversed. The sheer crushing gravity of compound interest was tearing the empire apart. Finally, the system snapped. In 1557, King Philip II looked at his completely empty treasury, looked at the massive mountain of Genoese debt, and realized the mathematical impossibility of his situation. He had no choice but to do the unthinkable. The Spanish Empire, the nation that literally controlled the global money printer, the nation that possessed mountains of solid silver, officially declared a sovereign default. They went totally, completely bankrupt. It was a shockwave that devastated the European financial system. But Spain didn't learn their lesson. Because they still controlled the mines, they simply renegotiated the debt and kept fighting. They would go on to declare sovereign bankruptcy again in 1575, then again in 1696, 1607, 1627, 1647. The greatest transfer of wealth in human history had ended in absolute humiliation. The empire had eaten itself alive.
The spectacular collapse of the Spanish Empire leaves us with the most important and brutal financial lesson in human history. Currency is not wealth. Spain had absolute control over the global money printer. They extracted mountains of silver and possessed more hard currency than any other nation on earth. But because they became arrogant, relied entirely on imports, and actively destroyed their own domestic production and innovation, all that money simply flowed right through their fingers and directly into the hands of their geopolitical rivals. Real wealth is not the amount of gold locked inside a vault, and it's certainly not the number of digital zeros sitting in a bank account. Real wealth is the actual productive capacity of a nation. It is the tangible goods, the services, the technology, the agriculture, and the infrastructure that a society produces. Money is simply the measuring stick we use to trade those things. When you drastically increase the measuring sticks without increasing the actual goods, you don't get richer, you just get the price revolution. You get hyperinflation. Today, we are watching this exact same historical tragedy repeat itself on a terrifying global scale. Modern central banks and politicians believe they can solve every economic crisis by simply printing trillions of fiat dollars out of thin air. They operate under the exact same delusion as King Philip II. They believe they have found the infinite money glitch. But just like the Spanish monarchy, they are discovering that you cannot print true wealth. You can only print currency. And the inevitable mathematical result is always the same: crushing inflation, staggering sovereign debt, and the slow, painful destruction of the middle class. The rise and fall of the Spanish Empire was not a historical accident. It was just one iteration of a brutal economic cycle that has repeated itself for thousands of years. Every single global superpower in history follows the exact same highly predictable pattern from its golden age to its catastrophic collapse. If you want to know exactly where the modern global economy stands right now in that cycle and how much time we have left before the current system completely resets, you need to watch my full breakdown right here. The 7 stages of empire collapse, why America is at stage 6. Click the video on your screen right now or find the link down in the pinned comment below. The cracks in the foundation are already here. I will see you in that video.